was September of 1888. The streets of Whitechapel were a dark and frightening place at the best of times. I had spent 15 years on the beat in the East End, so I knew better than most what went on in that shadowy corner of the capital.
By that autumn, with a killer on the loose, the streets became even darker and even more frightening. The gruesome murders had left the entire city in a state of panic and chaos. In February that year, I was promoted to Inspector First Class. But the following autumn, I was seconded from my new position and assigned to the case of the murder of a woman named Annie Chapman. I could not have known the terror and frustration of what was to come. The hunt for one of the most elusive and mysterious killers in history. Jack the Ripper.
Whitechapel in the 1880s was very much one of the poorest parts of town. Generations of extreme poverty, extreme unemployment and extreme overcrowding had turned large parts of the area into slum ghettos, and it was a horrible place to live. There were a number of different people who were living in Whitechapel at the time. You had the working poor, for example. Certain streets were seen as worse than others. So certain streets, people had menial jobs and they were able to work and pay the rent. Other streets at the time were described as vicious and semi-criminal. There wasn't really a step down after the slums of Whitechapel. It really didn't get much worse than that. The area was dangerous, unfit to be lived in, gloomy by day, dark and dangerous by night, and it was a horrible place to live. A number of the buildings were collapsing, were unfit to be lived in. Mice and rats infested the walls. It was a desperate time for tens of thousands of people in the Whitechapel and Spitalfields area. Back in Victorian times, prostitution was illegal, but due to the horrible living conditions that so many people were forced to contend with, it had become so widespread that the police were just simply unable to do anything about it, and it was just something that seemed to happen in a lot of areas. Prostitutes in Victorian times, much like those today, would put themselves in great danger. People forced to work the streets put themselves in great danger to do so, and much like today, numerous women in the Whitechapel area will have been beaten, raped, ripped off, and been subjected to any manner of criminality as they're forced on the streets to try and get the money to feed themselves. Crime was very widespread in Victorian Whitechapel, but it was a lot of poverty-driven crime, a lot of thefts, muggings, burglaries, that kind of thing. Prostitution had become rife. People were desperate and were doing absolutely anything they could to get the money to find a bed for the night and feed themselves. Murder wasn't overly common in Victorian times. People often think that there were murders happening all the time in the streets, and there weren't. It would happen occasionally, and if they were to hang somebody, the newspapers would make a big song and dance out of it. But murder wasn't overly common, and certainly not serial killer murder, mutilation in the street kind of murders. That was something that was entirely unheard of.
It all began with the murder of Mary Ann Nichols. I was handed the file which informed me of the killing of 42-year-old Mary Ann Nichols, whose body was found on Bucks Row on the 31st of August, 1888. Mary Ann Nichols had been a casual prostitute who was residing in a lodging house in nearby Thrall Street. Her marriage failed in 1880 due to her frequent overindulgence in alcohol. After this, she had begun working the streets in order to earn a living.
Mary Ann Nichols, at the time of her murder, was a 43-year-old Englishwoman who at the time was living at number 18 Thrall Street in the Spitalfields area of Whitechapel. She'd previously been married to a man named William, with whom she had had 5 children. But William had actually ran off with the midwife that delivered the 5th of her children and left Mary Ann to herself. He'd been forced to pay her an alimony payment monthly, but then it stopped. She'd taken him to court over that, and he had said in the courtroom that he had had her watched and knew that she was living as a prostitute. In Victorian times, that meant he didn't have to pay her anymore, so he stopped paying her the money. That then led to her being entirely homeless and sleeping rough in Trafalgar Square. She'd then been taken by police and admitted to a number of workhouses, and then eventually had ended up, at the time of the murder, in Thrall Street, one of the worst streets in the area, in the middle of the worst slum district in London, desperate and just trying to survive.
In the early hours of 31st August 1888, the body of Mary Ann Nichols was discovered in a stable entrance on Bucks Row.
On the night of her murder, Mary Ann Nichols had been staying at Wilmot's lodging house at number 18 Thrall Street in Spitalfields, and having spent some time in the Frying Pan pub on the corner of Thrall Street and Brick Lane, she had been back in the lodging house at midnight, but had been thrown out of the lodging house because she didn't have money to pay for the bed. It would appear at this point she had produced a hat, according to a number of witnesses. It was a new hat that she'd apparently found somewhere in the street. She placed it onto her head and said, "Don't worry, save the bed for me. I'll soon be back. Look what a jolly bonnet I've got." She then left the lodging house. At 2:30 that morning, she was then seen on nearby Osborne Street by a woman who actually worked at Wilmot's lodging house. She was so drunk, she said that she could barely stand up. She offered to take her back to the lodging house, but Mary Ann refused, saying that she'd already earned her money 3 times that day and had spent it. She headed off alone down Whitechapel Road, drunk, at 2:30 in the morning, and that was the last time that she was seen alive.
Around 3:40 a.m., Charles Cross, a carter, found the body lying in Bucks Row on her back, legs straight out.
She was lying on the path on the south side of the road outside of Brown's stables yard, and was found originally by 2 men called Charles Cross and Robert Paul as they made their way to work, but it was so dark they were unaware that a murder had taken place.
Unsure whether she was dead or simply sleeping, they decided to get back to work and inform a policeman when they saw one. They did not raise the alarm. A few minutes later, a constable was inspecting the stable yard next to the board school when he noticed the body of a woman lying on her back. Upon closer inspection by the light of his lamp, he found that Mary had sustained horrific wounds. Mary's throat had been slashed from ear to ear and cut back to the vertebrae. Her windpipe and gullet had been severely slashed, and there had also been extensive slashing and ripping of her abdomen.
And the investigation began.
The police had been questioning the neighborhood's prostitutes about the character who had a reputation for being violent and had been extorting money from them for the past year. Rumors had been circulating that the killings were the work of a Jewish man dubbed Leather Apron, who had a reputation for violence against prostitutes in the East End. On the 5th of September, 1888, the Star newspaper published a write-up on Leather Apron. These rumors resulted in growing anti-Semitic sentiment in the area.
The case surrounding the murder of Annie Chapman begins earlier that night at number 35 Dorset Street, at Crossingham's lodging house where she was staying. 3:30 in the morning, she was sitting in the kitchen of the lodging house when she was approached by the manager and asked if she had the money for the bed. She said she did not, but told him to save the bed for her. She would soon be back. She would find the money. She left the lodging house at 3:30 in the morning and then wasn't seen again until a body was then discovered at 5 to 6 that morning in the rear yard of number 29 Hanbury Street, heavily mutilated with her throat cut, her body posed, objects arranged around her body.
At 6 a.m. on the 8th of September, 1888, John Davis, a resident of 29 Hanbury Street, came downstairs, walked through the narrow passageway of the building, and opened the back door. At the foot of the stairs, he found the body of 47-year-old Annie Chapman lying flat on her back. A deep cut had been slashed across her throat. Her intestines had been pulled out and laid across her shoulder. Missing from the body were the uterus and parts of the bladder. The contents of her pockets had been arranged around her, and lying nearby was a neatly folded leather apron.
Annie Chapman in 1888 was a 47-year-old woman who at the time of her murder was staying in the slums at number 35 Dorset Street, Crossingham's lodging house, which is one of the worst places to stay in the entire area. Annie Chapman had somewhat fallen from grace as well. She had a very tragic backstory that had led her to the slums in Whitechapel in the first place. She had previously lived in Mayfair, she lived in Windsor, she'd been married to her husband John, and the pair had had 3 children together. But their husband, John, would appear to have been disabled and had been sent to live in a home. Their daughter, Emily, then died at the age of 12 from meningitis. That would seem to have put a great strain on the marriage, at which point they both would seem to have started drinking heavily. They'd gone their separate ways. Annie Chapman had ended up cast into the slums and then had found herself stuck there permanently when her husband, John, drank himself to death on Christmas Day 1886. From that time onwards, she had been living a degraded life of desperation and destitution, trying to do anything she could to keep going in the slums of Whitechapel and Spitalfields. Annie Chapman's body was discovered at shortly before 6 o'clock in the morning by 56-year-old John Davis, who actually lived on the top floor of number 29 Hanbury Street. He woke up at 5:45 that morning, he said, knowing the time because he heard the clock at the brewer's on Brick Lane strike the quarter hour as he got out of bed. He made him and his wife a cup of tea for around 10 minutes, he said, then descended the stairs to use the only toilet on the property. There was an outhouse in the back right corner of the yard. On arriving at the ground floor, he realised that the front door was standing wide open and was against the wall. He went to the back door, he opened it outwards and to the left, and on looking out into the yard, discovered the horribly mutilated body of Annie Chapman at the bottom of a few steps and to the left, in between the steps and the fence. Objects had been ranged around her at the crime scene. Blood had been smeared on the wall, and whoever the killer was long gone. The murder of Annie Chapman caused a sensation in the area, and it was now vividly clear to the people living in the Whitechapel area that somebody among them was murdering the women in the area. There was a huge amount of pressure on the police to catch the killer, and police immediately were sure that this was the same man that had murdered Martha Tabram and Mary Ann Nichols only a week earlier. Her body was found posed in a very similar way. The injuries were consistent with the murders that had gone before. Objects arranged around her at the crime scene seemed reminiscent of the crime scene on Bucks Row. It was clear to everybody that this was the same man. He'd struck again, and it was imperative that we find him.
Our interviews confirmed that a Jewish man named John Pizer was who the streetwalkers called Leather Apron.
John Pizer was in his 30s and he lived at number 22 Mulberry Street nearby. On the morning of the 10th, he was arrested at home by a Sergeant William Thick. He was arrested without complications. Anybody who witnessed the arrest apparently was completely unaware of what was happening. He was then taken quickly to Commercial Street Police Station, where he was interviewed for at least 2 days. The police were convinced he wasn't actually the killer after all, because he had an airtight alibi for the first 2 murders. At that point, it became clear that while he was in fact the character known as Leather Apron, he couldn't possibly have been the killer.
On September 27th, 1888, a missive addressed to the boss arrived at the Central News Agency.
Dear boss, he said, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but it won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about Leather Apron gave me real fits.
It was signed,
Good luck, yours truly, Jack the Ripper.
it is that letter that gave the killer the name by which you will forever be known.
There was no definitive way of telling whether the letter was genuine or not. We each had our theories. I, however, was not convinced until he murdered again. On September the 30th, there was another murder in Berners Street, just off Commercial Road. The victim was Elizabeth Stride, a 44-year-old prostitute.
On the night of Elizabeth Stride's murder, she had actually been seen at around 11 o'clock that night drinking with an unknown man in the Bricklayer's Arms on nearby Settle Street. Later on that evening, she'd then been seen by a couple of people in the Berners Street area, and then at around 12:45 had been seen by a man named James Brown talking to a strange individual on Fairclough Street, only moments away from where the murder took place. Whoever the man was, he had his back turned to James Brown as he walked past, but he saw him to be a stoutish built man who stood around 5'7" to 5'9" and wore a long trench coat that came almost to his heels. As he walked past, he heard Elizabeth tell the man, no, not tonight, maybe some other night, and Elizabeth was never seen alive again. She would later be found dead, only seconds away from where she was seen in that witness sighting, lying on her back with a throat cut on the floor of Dutfield Yard. Elizabeth Stride was first discovered at around 1:01 by a 26-year-old man called Louis Dean Schutz. She was lying on her back in Dutfield Yard off Berners Street, which lay at the side of number 40, which was a working men's club where Louis Dean Schutz actually worked himself. He'd been returning home when he discovered the body. The call quickly went out for police, and when police turned up, they realised that, like the victims before her, her throat had been cut deeply, and she was posed on her back with her head to the side, her eyes wide open, her hand across her chest. The killer had removed a hat from her head and placed it on the ground behind her, scattered objects around her body, smeared the blood from a neck wound across her hand and her forearm, and then ran. She was lying in exactly the same position as Annie Chapman had been, and as soon as the police discovered the crime scene, it was very obvious that the same killer had struck again.
The same night, only a few miles to the west, the killer struck again. The victim was Catherine Eddowes, a 46-year-old prostitute who had been found dead in Mitre Square, with her throat slashed and her abdomen mutilated.
In the hours leading up to her murder, Catherine Eddowes had actually been arrested for drunkenness on Aldgate at around 8 o'clock that evening. She'd been taken by 2 police officers to Bishopsgate Police Station, where she was placed in a cell to sleep it off, and was then released from police custody at around 1 o'clock that morning. Around half an hour later, she was then seen by 3 witnesses in the nearby vicinity talking to a strange man on the end of Church Passage, which led into Mitre Square. Whoever the man was, this time he stood facing the 3 witnesses as they passed by in the dark, but whoever he was, the 3 passed on, made their way home and didn't look back to see where he went. The body of Catherine Eddowes was discovered at 1:46 that morning, lying in the south corner of Mitre Square by PC Edward Watkins of the City of London Police. She was lying on her back with her legs wide apart, both hands by her side, exactly as Martha Chapman had been lying in George Yard back on the 7th of August. Her throat had been cut violently in 2 places. The killer had mutilated her abdomen, pulled her intestines from inside her and stuffed them into a throat wound. A 2.5-foot section of her colon had been removed from inside her and was lying by her left arm at the crime scene. The killer had inflicted a number of knife injuries to her face, removed her left kidney and her entire womb and taken them with him from the crime scene, along with nearly half of a white apron she was wearing. It had been torn from her at the crime scene, covered in blood, and the killer had taken that with him too.
On October the 1st, 1888, the Jack the Ripper letter went public. It was printed in newspapers and a mania broke out. People travelled from all around to the murder sites. It was akin to a carnival atmosphere. It hampered our investigation immensely.
Having received the Dear Boss letter a few days before, a number of tabloids then printed it alongside news reports of the new double murder. This only amplified the terror in the area. Now the killer had a name. People didn't know who he was, but you now knew who it was doing this, and his name was Jack the Ripper.
I witnessed firsthand the impact that the media had on our investigation. From the very beginning, the sensationalist coverage of the murders created a climate of fear and hysteria in the city, making it difficult for us to conduct a thorough and methodical investigation as we intended.
I think by making the Dear Boss letter public, the newspapers were hoping to cause hysteria and sell as many newspapers as possible, and that's exactly what they did. With the double murder having taken place, and with the Dear Boss letter having been held back a couple of days since it was originally received by the Central News Office, it was then printed in a number of tabloids alongside reports of the double murder. This created an absolute sensation in the area. Sold enormous numbers of newspapers, and people in the area were now absolutely aware of who it was they were up against. This also, however, started to attract the attention of imitators, hoaxers, and any manner of people who wanted to cause trouble in the investigation. Soon, a barrage of fake letters would arrive at newspaper offices, police stations, and even private homes across the country from other individuals also claiming to be the killer. newspaper attention given to the Dear Boss letter caused such a sensation that writing Jack the Ripper letters, they said, had become a national pastime. Literally hundreds of them were pouring in from all over the place in different handwriting from different places. Police now have to investigate this. It was wasting thousands of hours of police time. And yes, it is very much going the way of the investigation. Criticism of the police force isn't a new thing, and in Victorian England, as the Jack the Ripper case continued and the murder remained at large, police were taking enormous amounts of criticism from both the press and public alike. The pressure on the police to catch the killer was enormous.
Rumours and false leads spread like wildfire. Every day it seemed like a new suspect was being named and then quickly cleared, diverting our attention and resources away from more promising leads. This constant barrage of information also made it difficult to separate fact from fiction, and many people began to accuse us of incompetence and corruption.
It must have been very frustrating for the police force to have, under such enormous pressure, to be conducting interviews and interviewing witnesses and still feel like they were not getting anywhere. The enormous amounts of criticism levelled at them from all areas of the British press was only making things more complicated, and the sheer number of fake stories, fake letters and fake reports that were coming into the police as well was only complicating the case even further.
October came and went, and no further murders occurred. We kept up our investigations, but we were all convinced that perhaps it was over, and we could soon solve the case and return to normal. But we were to be proved wrong. As in the second week of November, the Ripper struck again, one last time.
Some people in the area might have been breathing a sigh of relief. Some people might have thought that the killer had died. Some people might have thought he moved away. Some people might have thought he could have gone to prison for something else. But he was then, once we got into November, he would make himself known yet again, just down the road on Dorset Street, in the middle of the Spitalfields area, to commit what surely was his worst murder of all. Of all of the Jack the Ripper victims, the least is known about Mary Jane Kelly. At the time of her murder, she was 25 years old, and everything that we know about Mary Kelly comes somewhat second-hand from her boyfriend, Joseph Barnett, and statements he made to the police and things that he claimed she had told him. Mary Kelly is widely believed to have been born somewhere in Limerick in Ireland, and had moved over to London only a year or two before her death. She would appear to have lived for a short period of time out in France. She lived for a short period of time in Wales, but at the time of her murder was staying only doors away from where Annie Chapman had been staying on Dorset Street, which was considered to be the worst slum street in the Whitechapel area and potentially the worst slum street in all of London.
The last and most gruesome murder was that of Mary Jane Kelly, a 25-year-old prostitute. Her body was found in her room in Miller's Court, Dorset Street. The killer had not only slit her throat, but had also mutilated her face and body beyond recognition. The scene was so gruesome that it left even the most experienced officers and doctors shaken.
Like the other victims before her, she was lying on her back with her head to the side, her eyes wide open, her hand placed across her chest, her legs wide apart. But unlike the other victims, she'd been extremely heavily mutilated. The majority of her face had been removed, both of her thigh bones had actually been stripped down to the bone, and the meat that had been cut from her thighs and her buttocks to do that had been placed in a pile on the bedside table next to her head. Her liver was lying in between her feet, her intestines were down the right side of the body, half the right lung was under the right arm, the spleen was under the left arm. Whoever the killer was, police believed he had been in the room for at least 2 hours at this particular crime scene, unlike the few minutes he spent at the other ones, and the original police report stated that when police arrived in the room, organs from inside her body had been draped across the back of the chairs and were hanging from nails in the wall.
The murders had a similar pattern, and it was evident that they were committed by the same person. The killer had targeted prostitutes and had mutilated their bodies in a particular way. It was a brutal and savage crime that shook the entire city.
The pressure that had been building on the police throughout the Jack the Ripper case really came to a point after the murder of Mary Kelly. Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren was taking more criticism from all angles than he ever had before, and actually resigned the day after that Mary Kelly was found. The police now were taking severe criticism all the time from all angles. The killer, it appeared, seemed to be right under their noses the entire time, and they simply couldn't catch him.
The murders had a similar pattern, and it was evident that they were committed by the same person. The killer had targeted prostitutes and had mutilated their bodies in a particular way. It was a brutal and savage crime that shook the entire city. As the lead investigator on the Jack the Ripper case, I spent hundreds, even thousands of hours poring over the evidence and chasing down any potential leads. Over the years, I have developed several personal theories as to the identity of the killer, but I have been unable to definitively prove any of them. We had to rely on our instincts and the evidence found at the scene of the crimes. We analyzed the bloodstains, the footprints, and the clothes found on the victims. We searched for any connections between the victims and the killer, but always came up short. We each had our theories, but nothing concrete. One of my most persuasive theories is that the killer was a local butcher or slaughterman. The Ripper's ability to quickly and skillfully dissect his victims' bodies suggests a certain level of anatomical knowledge, and butchers, fishmongers, and slaughtermen would have had access to the necessary tools and experience. Additionally, many of the murders took place near or within areas that were known to have a high concentration of such professionals.
Another suspect, though, had now come to police attention, and his name was Jacob Eisenschmidt. Jacob Eisenschmidt was actually known by some people as the Mad Butcher of Holloway, and after talking to his wife, police learned that his butcher's shop in Holloway had gone bust. He'd had some sort of breakdown, and he wasn't the same guy he used to be. His wife said he was completely irrational, he was very violent, he was very dangerous, he always carried big knives with him, he was in the habit of drinking at a local pub in Whitechapel. When it was learned that he was absent from his lodging house on the night of the murder of Annie Chapman, it became very obvious that there was now another suspect and the hunt was on to find him. Police at the time said that one of the biggest problems they had to contend with was the sheer number of people in the area who fitted the rough, fake description of the wanted man, were constantly getting themselves into trouble, were acting inappropriately while drunk with women, or in some cases were boldly incriminated by other individuals. Joseph Barnett, Montague Druitt. Another name was Michael Ostrog, who was his Russian barber surgeon who would appear to have been in London at the time. Albert Backett. Dr. Francis Tumbley was an American quack doctor who lived out in New York on the East Coast. Charles Cross, Prince was having an affair, and the royal doctor was sent to silence everyone that knew about it. James Maybrick, George Chapman Kosminski, and he never gave a first name. But in the time since then, people decided it must have been this Aaron Kosminski, who was this mentally ill man that lived in the area. Jacob Eisenschmidt, Thomas Cutbush. It became very frustrating for the police the longer the case went on, that there really seemed to be no suspects. There were wild rumours and wild accusations, but once John Pizer and Jacob Eisenschmidt had been ruled out of the investigation, there really wasn't a lot to go on after that. It seemed that if the killer was going to be caught, he was going to be caught red-handed, or he possibly wasn't going to be caught at all. I think if this investigation was taking place now, Albert Backett is far and away the number one person investigators would want to go and speak to. His parents were German. He was born and raised in Whitechapel. He's the right age. He fits the right description. He's got a criminal record for all the things you'd expect a serial killer to have today. He was constantly injecting himself into the investigation. He told the police that he'd met the killer and spoken to him on a couple of occasions. He told the police that the killer was writing letters to his house to threaten him and warn him of murders. He claimed that the killer was writing graffiti on the wall of his house, but it was washed away before police could photograph it. He turned up entirely uninvited to the inquest of Francis Coles at the Working Lads Institute on Whitechapel Road, demanding to be on the jury just when the jury were about to be taken to view a body in the mortuary, and caused such a big scene when they wouldn't let him that the coroner told him if he didn't sit down and behave himself, he was going to have the police remove him from the building. He also worked as an engraver, which is interesting, engraving the plates for banknote printing, because there were a number of women in the area who got attacked but got away, and later told the police that the killer, or the attempted killer, had conned them with fake coins. These coins were reportedly polished extremely brightly and then machined around the edges, it was said, to appear like half crowns typically, which were very valuable when actually they were cheap coins and worth next to nothing. Albert Backett, as a copper plate engraver, would have had all the tools and the knowledge to manipulate those coins in that fashion in the house. And then in 1889, they actually took him to court and charged him on 2 separate occasions for passing counterfeit coins exactly like that in a number of different pubs throughout the East End. The murders in Whitechapel had caused such a sensation, attracted so much attention, and been such a big deal that people were forced for the first time to really pay attention, not just to the horrors that had happened, but to the horrible living conditions that these people were forced to endure in the East End. If anything positive came out of any of it, it was that such attention was now focused on the slums and the poverty and the lodging houses, and now people across London who previously had paid no real attention to the slums and the poverty and the people who lived there were now so disgusted by the conditions under which these people were continuing to have to live that they were now demanding something be done to change that. Numbers of people were demanding now that conditions in the East End had to be improved, street lighting needed to be introduced, something needed to be done to make the place safer. And it would be a very long and slow process, but eventually that would start to happen. I think the reason people are so interested in Jack the Ripper, and the reason why the case and stories of it are inevitably going to stick around for decades or centuries to come, is it's partly the violence, it's partly the area that it happened in, and the slums and the cobblestones and the misery and the poverty, but it was also the first time that something like that happened in a major city with what would be referred to as a modern press following it. So it was the first case to receive anywhere near the amount of publicity it did. And then, of course, because they never caught him, it's just something that's always kind of stuck around in the public imagination. I think for decades to come, Jack the Ripper will still be getting talked about when numerous other criminal cases have been long since forgotten.